Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So the episode that you're about to hear is the last in our schedule of what might be called our normal programming. This is because it was recorded many months ago, with Alex and I getting together to discuss popular television programme Dungeons and Dragons. Since then, however, things have changed. Alex and I are both self-isolating as a result of recent circumstances, meaning that we're currently holed up many miles away from each other and recording this remotely via the wonders of technology.
So I'm holed up here in London, refusing to go outside because there's too many people about.
And I'm doing something similar down in Kent. But to make the most of this unprecedented situation and to continue the podcast release every 2 weeks, however, we're offering the chance for our listeners to get involved. This means we'd like you to play a part in the next lineup of podcasts, and you can do so in two ways.
That's right. Firstly, we are aware that as times have changed, our viewing habits and media consumption has probably changed too. I know, for example, that over the last few weeks, have been watching a lot more 90s television serial dramas than I was a month ago, and eating a lot more mini Battenbergs. We're all changing, we're all adapting, and we need films to help us through this mess.
So, firstly, let us know your favourite feel-good film, the fantasy animation that you've turned to in these challenging times. Get in touch via the website and on social media using the hashtag FeelGoodFanAnim. Let us know and we'll aim to do it on the podcast.
Absolutely. Is it a nostalgic favourite that you've not watched in years that you're rewatching constantly now? Is it a film that's unexpected, a film that you sort of perhaps didn't really have a prior relationship to before this crisis that now you find yourself turning to? Perhaps it's a guilty pleasure, if you even believe such a thing exists. Let us know the film you're turning to make you feel good.
Secondly, we'd love you to be a virtual guest on the podcast. So if there are any animators, academics, creative practitioners out there, fan communities, drop us a line via the website with an idea of a film or a television programme, and we'll get in touch and endeavour to get you on as a guest to talk about it.
Absolutely. We want to talk about films that make us happy, films that get us through troubling times, and fantasies and animations tends to be the kind of stuff we're looking for in circumstances such as these. So let us know your feel-good fantasy animation.
Or drop us a line via the website and get in touch, and we'll endeavour to get you as a guest on the next round of fantasy animation podcasts.
So you can get in contact via the normal social media streams. Our Twitter handle is FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. The same for Instagram, which is now live. You're going to hear me at the end of this episode say it doesn't exist yet. I am lying. Instagram is live, shiny and ready to use, as well as on Facebook and also, of course, through our website, fantasy-animation.org.
Or you can get onto social media and use the hashtag FeelGoodFanAnim, FeelGoodFanAnim. Let us know your favourite or your feel-good fantasy animation, hashtag FeelGoodFanAnim, and we'll do it as an episode on the podcast.
But for now, enjoy the show.
Hey, look! A Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening?
Whoa!
Fear not, Ranger, Barbarian, Magician, Thief, Cavalier and Acrobat.
Hello listeners and welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast, your fortnightly guide to all things animated, dragon-related and dungeony, particularly with this episode.
That's a very specific introduction that relates to only, well, not to only this episode, but...
I think we've been dungeony in the past, haven't we?
We have. We have.
What's been our most dungeony episode up until this point?
Yes, a new feature of the podcast. If you'd have asked me it before this episode,
Yes.
I don't know what I would have said.
Sure.
But after this episode, I'll say this one.
Tweet us our most dungeony episode at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. Apparently, I do mess it up if I do it at the beginning, but at the end, I'm smooth as you like.
Alex, what's the podcast for this week?
This episode, we are doing the television series Dungeons and Dragons, released between the years 1983 and 1985, originally broadcast on CBS in America, as well as syndicated and shown all around the world. I think it was shown on Saturday morning kids television here in the UK, at least that's where I remember it from. So a nostalgic trip to the past for some of us, and a perhaps completely new introduction for others, and I'm looking particularly at Chris when I say that.
As the only other person in this room, it's nice to be back in a room with just you to do a podcast.
Always, it's better this way, isn't it? You know, we have to be on our best behaviour when there's other people around.
Yeah, this is true. Yes, I'd heard of Dungeons and Dragons as a game, and ultimately it's this kind of big franchise now, this multimedia, transmedia franchise. But I was not familiar with the program itself, so I watched it online on YouTube. Watched it online. What I found interesting was that the suggestions, I've now watched this, and maybe were a list of programs that I were familiar with. Brave Star, He-Man. So now the algorithms are working overtime because it's now suggesting things that are kind of connected to this program. But I'd never seen Dungeons and Dragons, the series.
Had you heard of this particular series?
No, I'd not heard of this particular series, and doing a bit of reading about it. Its connection to Marvel. When I was watching the program, it come up with Marvel Productions. And was animated by a Japanese animation company who I was familiar with, the kind of Toei Animation company, but I wasn't familiar with the program per se. But as I started to watch it, the contributors, so particularly the voice artists, were names that I was familiar. I don't know whether this was one of their first kind of gigs, but certainly looking at the cast list, there are now actors and actresses and voice performers that have gone on to The Simpsons or gone on to do kind of Nickelodeon. So I am interested in the program. It was I'm not going to pretend it was an easy watch. It was a hard watch. But and there were 27 episodes in total, so 13 in the first series, 8 in the second. I think 6.
Yeah, it got cancelled halfway through the final third.
But 6/7. So there's this missing final episode. There's a bit of mythology around it beyond the themes of the program itself. So a bit of mythology around this missing last episode, and the script is, I believe, available online.
I think it was released as a DVD extra as well when the sort of DVD Blu-ray.
Oh, I see.
Although I watched it by streaming, so I can't say I've seen it, but I think they did a few sort of, they put it together with some storyboards and acted out the lost script. So I think there was a bit of discussion on that.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. I've got no idea what I'm going to say, but that's for me to discover along the way.
Yeah,
much
sure.
like the children of the program.
Well, so I found it a bit of a slog too. I have seen it before, or at least I've seen a few episodes, I think. I remember it being on Saturday morning television, and probably I've probably misremembered this, but in my memory, on like Live and Kicking or something equivalent, where like you'd introduce it and it would sort of jump straight into it, kind of stuff with presenters. And as soon as the opening title sequence started on the first episode, rewatching it now, where a small boy goes, "Hey, look, it's a Dungeons and Dragons ride," I immediately sort of snapped back into some sort of primordial version of my own self, and I've definitely vividly remember that title sequence. I can't say I remember much else about it other than the basic sort of structure and format, where so the narrative sort of
it's very formulaic when you watch them in quite a concentrated I suppose that sort of method of watching creates links between texts that might not have a link, but my goodness, when you watch them in quite a concentrated fashion like this, the dialogue is not diverse, shall we say.
Well, I think maybe that's an interesting place to start with it, in that I was struck by that. I was struck by how episodic and formulaic the show was. And my experience of watching it as a kid is probably the best experience you're going to have with it, in that this is a show seemingly made in an era of television, right, where the sort of reliance on a week-by-week viewing pattern doesn't really exist, right? And instead, and this has been talked about in television studies more than fantasy or animation studies, the sort of long-form serial narration isn't really kicking into gear just yet. Certainly not with sort of, quote-unquote lowbrow productions like this. So what we get here, which I think is very interesting, is a high fantasy series that very much is made for an audience that's going to miss a few episodes, and therefore the basic narrative beats are extremely episodic, which I found quite surprising, because you would have thought Dungeons and Dragons, high fantasy, alternative world, myth, legend, quests.
Yep.
What you would get is this great big, almost incomprehensible narrative feature, but what we get instead is something that's very easy to digest. In fact, there's no sort of opening episode, there's no pilot, there's no origin story. The origin story is told every week in that opening 30-second title sequence, and then we just jump into basically Monster of the Week format.
Yeah, no, the opening title, as I said, it's interesting to me because when you watch the program from the first episode, it feels like you're joining something in the middle, and actually that's something that remains consistent. The fact that there is no sort of quote unquote establishing shot to get you into kind of what's happening. So the title sequence does something that I've never really seen title sequences do before. Is that it is the title sequence, but also the pre-credit sequence, while also being the blurb on the back of the book or the DVD or something like that. So you can join the program at any episode and understand what's going on, because the first episode might as well have been the middle of season 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I was expecting the episode. So the title sequence in about 30-40 seconds, it tells you the basic sort of narrative parameters you're dealing with, which is there's a bunch of kids ranging from, I suspect the oldest is supposed to be about sort of 14, 13, to down to about sort of 10, I would suggest.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of group of young
high school. I think
high school to middle school, I think would be the American sort of definition of it.
Yep.
They go on a Dungeons and Dragons ride. It's somehow magical or cursed. They get zapped into the realm of Dungeons and Dragons. They meet the Dungeon Master, who is this sort of slightly Yoda-ish.
Slightly Yoda-ish, my goodness.
All right.
He is one poorly constructed sentence away from being a character in a Star Wars movie.
Who is their sort of guide through the realm, and they are on a quest to try and find a way back home. And on the quest, they have to battle against Venger, the force of evil, and all other kinds of monsters and antagonists that exist within the realm at the same time. So that's sort of set up in the first 30, 40 seconds. And then what you
get...
Every episode, yes. Literally, basically what I just said is said in the first sort of, and then what you get is... each episode is sort of the problem of the week episode. So there's not really any overarching narrative other than that. What there is instead is they walk into a particular land and discover a problem and help solve it and then go on their way. So it sets up a structure that can be repeated throughout.
Yeah. So the characters themselves, and I think this was the first sort of couple of notes that I had where I was trying to pull in different animation influences. The first note I had was just very Scooby-Doo. So in the way that so you have Hank, and what I like about the characters as well is that they are sort of blank canvases. Because there is no backstory, their identity in the program is the identity that they have, and so there's no sort of and there's no sort of disjuncture, I think, between what they used to be and what they now are. So when these characters get zapped, as you say, through the ride into the world of Dungeons and Dragons, they are immediately allocated roles by the Dungeon Master that is then, again, repeated as part of the title sequence. So you have Hank, who is a ranger, who uses this sort of like bow and arrow with a glowing bow and arrow with destructive arrows. You have Eric, who is probably my most favourite character, the Cavalier, because he is the most sarcastic, the more sardonic. He gets a lot more sarcastic, and actually as the series goes on and into the third series, and so I think he's probably my favourite. He is also the one that there's a couple of moments in episodes where he looks at the camera, which is very strange. He's funny. He doesn't really like being in this world, and he's often the one that has to be talked round.
He's very much the sort of Edmund of this world, from Lion the Witch of the Wardrobe. The sort of the character that doesn't quite buy into the sense of adventure,
or buy into the fantasy.
Just wants to go home
all the time,
and he's quite sort of curmudgeonly in his approach to it. Yeah,
you have
and he's the Cavalier, which is a sort of he has a sort of a shield and a sword and so much a kind of classical medieval knight sort of.
But it's interesting, just looking online at descriptions of him that suggest that he's a spoiled child. Again, you don't really get much of their backstory, so you don't get that sort of jarring.
You get hints.
I suppose you get hints when they are suggesting the things that they miss about the world. And there's a couple of episodes where they're foraging for food, and he shows his disgust that he's not used to that kind of cuisine. Diana, who's an acrobat, who is I guess the gymnast of the group, and a lot of her heroic moments come from her athleticism and her physicality.
And we're going to have to talk quite a bit about the racial problems surrounding Diana's character. She is dressed quite obviously as a sort of Amazonian
Yes,
kind
she
of
is.
warrior woman.
She adopts-
and is African American.
Yeah, but there's something interesting around. Maybe we'll get on to talk about the magical Negroes, the kind of magical Negro archetype. That there is a certain sort of degree of unknowable exoticism, or certainly the way that she's othered. Yes, we will talk about that. My second favourite character, Presto, who is this daft magician who can't get a spell right.
Yeah, and he's
his
sort of a
spells
nerdy figure, isn't he?
Yeah, his spells are grating to the ear because you know what's coming. He just rhymes this little rhyme thing, and then the wrong thing comes out. But he gets funnier.
More on Presto as well later. We have Sheila, the thief, who has a sort of invisible cloak, almost sort of very much was the Fantastic Four Invisible Woman from that kind of
Harry Potter.
Yes, that too. Yeah, sure.
But isn't the big thing about her is that she's never really. All the others are called magician, acrobat. She is never really called thief. She is just called Sheila. So in the program, she's never called the thing that she's always.
She's identified as the thief in
the title
sequence.
Yeah, but then she's just called Sheila.
She's not. Yeah, you're right.
And then we have a couple of others. So we have Bobby, the Barbarian, who I think is the youngest.
Yes, and I believe the younger brother of Sheila as well. That's sort of hinted at various points.
Yes.
Towards the end of the series, that's made quite clear.
Yeah, and then you have, I suppose, the other, or the two other characters that are the main ones are the Dungeon Master and Venger. You have Uni, who's this unicorn.
The obligatory comedy sort of
unicorn masquerading.
Psychic.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he as we talked about this in the previous podcast, the fact that a lot of animals in animation just end up being dogs. So it's a unicorn that might as well be a dog.
Yes.
It's like the horse entangled or whatever. It might as well be a dog.
Yeah.
So you have Uni, who is interesting as a character. Because the character is always there, but the voice, so it doesn't have a voice, but Frank Welker, who is a voice artist, and we'll talk about voice artistry, is known particularly for sort of sound effects and worked on Scooby-Doo and things like this. So he's quite a prominent voice artist.
Okay.
But it's really Dungeon Master, who is this, as you said, this Yoda-esque figure who speaks in riddles and rhymes.
So every episode he'll say something invariably in about the first 3 minutes, about 3 minutes 33, we'll say something like, you need to travel over here and the answer you're seeking will be found in a mirror that you cannot see through, or something sort of equally cryptic or something like that.
And then just disappears.
And then disappears, and then by about minute 18, it all becomes clear what he meant.
Yeah. Although there are nuggets, and I think more in the second series than the first. And what interests me actually is the discrepancy between the series. He becomes a character that gets a little bit more to him, and so there's a couple of lines of dialogue as the last lines of an episode that hint at something was his fault or something. He is connected to other characters in a particular kind of way. And then Venger. So Venger is really the primary antagonist.
Yes, he's a sort of great big gargoyle, evil monster, plotting Dark Lord, kind of, you know, again, fleshed out a little bit more in the later episodes, but certainly at the beginning, a very kind of generic stock.
Voiced by a big star. Big star. Optimus Prime. Big star.
Okay.
So we'll talk about as I said, the voice artistry in this program is one of the most interesting things for me, and certainly given that the program itself, and given that the program itself is from this period of children's television and sort of, I wouldn't say a rebirth, but we're moving towards in the 80s, that sort of late 80s rebirth, if you like, in inverted commas, of animation. You have a lot of decent Transformers. All the Brave Star, all the programs like He-Man, you get a lot of stuff in the 80s. So we can talk about that. Any other little characters? I mean, there's old demons and
and then you'll have the inevitable sort of monsters of the week that will pop up and engage with all these things. But usually Venger's behind it all. You think someone else is actually the villain, but it turns out it's Venger. They solve it, they move on, and about every 6 or 7 episodes, they normally find a way home, and then don't, and they have to keep carrying on their quest.
So this is an episode for us that is a return to the small screen. So we haven't done television for a long time. And it's also an advantage for us where we can look back on all of the episodes. I think when we've done previous series, we've sort of...
we've had to pause halfway through.
We've taken a look back and gone, this is where the series is at the moment, and I wonder where it will go subsequently. But here we've got 3 discrete series that are... that we can look at that are readily available online. So if you to buy. So if you're interested in the series, you should watch it, because it is interesting. And in terms of authorship, you have the same, pretty much the same directorial team. John Gibbs directs every single episode in collaboration with a guy called Bob Richardson in the first series. So it's very much I'm not going to use the word authorship, but he is. I mean, I'd be interested to learn more about John Gibbs as a figure and his contribution to American television in the 1980s. But it's a manageable 27-episode series that has some stuff to say about mythology and magic and friendship.
Well, let's start with mythology and magic then.
Sure.
So, I guess what interested me watching it primarily is its relationship a little bit to the role-playing game of which it's based on,
Yep.
and its relationship to sort of fantasy media history. So let's start with the role-playing game, if you'll indulge me
Yep.
for a second then. So do you know about Dungeons & Dragons, the game, at all?
Not really. I'm not a massive gamer more broadly, but I'm aware that it is popular, and I know a little bit about video games, but I'm not. I'm not a gamer as such.
If the QI elves here, the klaxon would just sound because that's the thing that I want to stress here for those who haven't engaged with Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons was a particularly popular sort of role-playing game in the 1970s, 74, I think it first came into fruition. It was a huge cultural phenomenon. I think it still exists, but I think it's been rivaled now in attention by things like World of Warcraft or Warhammer, and things like that. But this was the first one. And what I didn't know about Dungeons and Dragons, because believe it or not, I did not play this game when I was a kid. In fact, I wasn't a Warhammer person. I wasn't, to those who are out there, I consider you a friend and a brethren and a scholar, but I am not that person. It would be silly for me to pretend if I was. So I didn't know about it until I started doing a PhD on fantasy fiction, and I discovered it isn't a video game, and it isn't even a board game, really. What it is a collection of structures and rules that allow gamers to basically play whatever game they want. So all that the Dungeons and Dragons really is a set of props, including some dice, a way of doing battles and sort of formulating and regulating who wins and who loses. But the basic format of it is that you get a bunch of mates around, you get 6 friends around for an evening, you nominate one of them to be Dungeon Master, you pick a role within the story, and then you play Dungeons and Dragons. And the Dungeon Master will tell a story. We'll say if me and you were playing it right now and I was Dungeon Master, I'd say, right, Chris, you are, do you want to be warrior, a thief, or a wizard?
Wizard.
Right, fine. So you are a wizard and you are walking along a dark wood and an orc jumps out. Do you battle the orc or do you use your spell to make it go to sleep?
I'd say, that, or I'd say something sarcastic and make them listen to the podcast.
But, yes, sure. So yeah, you'd get their phone.
I'd get them to rate it on Apple Podcast is what I would do.
Smooth.
Yeah.
So basically, it's that. It's a communicative, creative exercise. It isn't. There are no rules. No one wins or loses other than what you decide within your own individual game.
So this is rife for questions of world building more broadly, and both as a game and how we play with props. There's a lot of writing on fictional worlds that talks about children and imagination and building worlds from props, and fictional worlds have their own props within them and characters. Part of the way that fictional worlds read as realistic is that within them they have characters who build fictional worlds, whose knowledge of a world will be partial or incomplete or whatever. So writing around fictional worlds is all about imagination and how we build props, and it seems like Dungeons and Dragons is part of that. You have loose structures and there's a world that you build around.
There isn't really a world, that's the thing. It's I think there are some
world
stock
in
monsters.
the act of doing it.
Yes, the Dungeon Master builds the world.
Interesting.
The individual Dungeon Master in a friendship group would build the world, and the players would participate in that world building. And actually, I when I found out about this, and I've played one game of Dungeons and Dragons in my life because a friend of mine, while I was doing the PhD, set up a game for me so I could sort of experience it. It was exactly this sort of collaborative, creative exercise. So it's an interesting thing to try and adapt, because there isn't really anything to adapt. It's just this sort of concept of playing along or role playing. And when sort of it's been done as a film in the sort of early noughties, disastrously so, and all this sort of, they just try and sort of replace it with some sort of generic, world building stories, high fantasy narrative. So in a way, what they do here in the TV series is try to replicate that almost in its sort of DNA. And what you get, right, is two things are adapted quite well. One is the almost messiness of the world building, and that I still, having watched 27 episodes of this, I still have no idea the geography, the sense of scale, the sense of base, any kind of formal detail about this world that we're living in. And it reflects the sort of dynamic between player and dungeon master. Dungeon master knows all. Dungeon master sets everything up, all that kind of stuff. And the final thing it does is it creates that kind of schism between the role you're playing, warrior, acrobat, wizard, and the sort of flesh and blood human going on at the same time. And there's a lot of interesting things we could talk about in terms of the relationship between the role they are playing, these characters in the world. So, Hank the Ranger, Eric the Cavalier, Diane the Acrobat, and who they are really. Because for some of them, I would argue, Hank the Ranger, that kind of works, because what Hank is in this role, he seems to be the sort of alpha male of the group. Yeah. He's the natural leader of the group.
He's Fred. He's Fred from Scooby-Doo.
He is Fred from Scooby-Doo, absolutely. He is Fred from Scooby-Doo. So him playing the sort of strong, masculine, that sort of... His role is a reflection of who he is in their group already.
Yes.
Eric, however, isn't a cavalier. No. He's not a chivalric knight. In fact, the whole point of that dynamic is that he's the opposite of that.
And I make the same claim about Presto. The point is that these are... And so actually I'm wondering...
Yeah, Presto's a geeky kid and he's playing this grand Merlin. Yeah.
So this is perhaps where the title sequence obtains its biggest effect, because it's showing that process of allocation. Mm-hmm. So actually within the title sequence, you have them wearing their normal clothes. This is 1980s America. They're going to the fun fair. They get on this ride. And then as part of their transformation, they change clothes and they wonder what's happening. They look at themselves. What am I wearing here? And then the Dungeon Master appears and magics the tools that they will need into their hands. And they become and take on these... roles. So that process of allocation...
By the Dungeon
Master is really important, because... I suppose narratively, given that this is serial television, it's catching us all up as audiences. But it seems like what you're saying is that it's also calling back to a sort of pure form of the game.
It's almost a ludic impulse, isn't it? It's the game they are all having to play in this world. You will play the role of this. You will play the role of that.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how that's if anything, if Dungeons and Dragons is anything, it's choosing to play which role.
Well, this is given that this is an adaptation, a dramatization of a game. This is obviously as well before an arrival of open world video games, where video games themselves are built on the rules of a particular, or the fictional logic of a game that you then go in and explore, and maps. And we've talked about this previously, maps, the role of map and map making. But the episodes function a lot more like levels and missions and things like this. So as you said earlier about the Monster of the Week, you have the narrative beats of each episode are very regular. Title sequence, meeting with Dungeon Master, going off to do something, defeating that person, Venger appears, they have a moment, it's all resolved, Dungeon Master appears again, momentary laugh, characters coming, having a good old laugh. Eric.
This is a very 80s show in that it does, I think about half of the episodes end with a hilarious joke and then them all cracking up.
Yeah. And then we're off. And actually so each episode functions like a particular mission or a particular level, and there's been a lot of writing on the relationship between film and video game, and what does it mean for a film to adopt a video game aesthetic, equally the other way around, how video games are becoming more and more cinematic, whatever that word actually ever means. But in this case, this is an interesting negotiation through animation of something that isn't really a video game but is closer to a role-playing game that plays out in the world with, as you say, props and counters and dice and things like this. I think I've not really thought about it in that way, but it places a lot of emphasis on the role of the title sequence to get us up to speed as we watch these episodes again and again and dip into the world. But it's the program is not about building a logical fictional world, as you said. It's not about the geography of the world. It's about how you build the world from its pieces.
And if you think about sort of the way the game would unfold, that's sort of okay, because if you get 6 people around a room to play a game with friends, it's very unlikely that after 80 sessions of doing it, they're going to have any coherent sense of the geography.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's about It's about the realm of Dungeons and Dragons seems to be a realm where you are free to take on archetypal fantasy roles and engage in a shared iconography that allows for different individual quests and adventures to take place. But that's sort of all, and that is what the show does, for better or
Yeah,
worse.
I suppose it does have a broad narrative, and the narrative is just simply these characters that want to get home. But they want to get back to America in 1983.
Yes,
but what I guess what is striking about the program is that they do that at various points, but they choose not to do it. So there are a couple of episodes in the first series where they have the chance, or they are already at home, and they have a chance to go through a particular portal, and they go back home, and they are standing right by where they disappeared.
happens quite a lot, actually. I think it probably happens a good 6 to 12 times throughout the whole series. So we're talking about, a quarter to a third of the episodes has a moment where they can either see the world or they manage to come back home, but for some reason or another they can't stay or they have to go back.
So there's an episode in the first series, episode 11, called The Box, which is about a box or a chest that at various points, if you put it on the ground, it opens up a portal to somewhere. And the end of the episode is that they have gone back home. They use that to go through the portal, and they are now back standing on the banks of the river before they went into this ride. Okay, so this is one of those moments where we pause the podcast and stop talking as we were then and start talking live. Well, not live, but...
We're always live and not live.
It's
hard to record in advance of the moment that you're recording.
Sure, this isn't a live stream.
No,
so
that's not what we've paused the podcast to talk to you about.
No, we have paused the podcast to talk to you, listeners and potential contributors, actually, about the blog element of the website. So if you visit fantasy-animation.org, you'll see that we run a weekly blog. So the blog itself pulls in different voices from lots of different places, whether you're an animator, creative practitioner, academic, whether you've been to a film festival, an academic conference, whether you are, been to the cinema, seen an animated fantasy television program. We'd love
to be an animator who's just produced new work and wants to talk about it, reflect on it creatively.
It could be
someone who's trying to get into film journalism, who wants to have a go at writing a review. You could just be a fan and love a particular subject matter, and you'd always want to talk about it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people kind of get in contact via the website. We have a little comments function, so if you send a little message to us with your potential idea, then we'll have a conversation about commissioning in it.
There's a tab, isn't there, at the top that says something like contact us and submit form.
Click on that. So you can contact us. And also you can follow us on social media, so give us an @ on Facebook, send us a message. So give us an @ on Twitter or send us a message on Facebook, and we'll get in touch. It would be great to kind of publish some of the new work that's being done, or hear from people that perhaps wouldn't have the opportunity to publish elsewhere. Get in touch.
Please do. Otherwise, we'll just get back to the show.
Let's. But unfortunately, Venger, the villain, comes with them, so they choose to, rather than stay in the world, they have to then go back into the fictional world of Dungeons and Dragons to bring Venger back with them so that he doesn't destroy their present. And so there are moments where they do have to play out that sort of, right, well, I need to embrace the fantasy, and they choose not to. So that's.
There's another one earlier on before that, actually, episode 6, Beauty and the Bog Beast.
Yes,
where Eric, our favourite, is turned into a
bog beast.
A bog beast.
Yes.
So, you can work out what that is. And again, they're offered the choice whether they will go back, and he'll stay a bog beast forever, or so there's a sort of more which is more important to you, your identity or your sense of home, and there's a lot of
your friends. They decide they miss the chance to go home because they decide to kind of be together as a team. And actually, a lot of the episodes are about that. One might go missing. One of the characters might go missing or get captured or turned into something else, and then they have to work as a team, or they split up and work in parallel teams. But they always kind of come together at the end. So there's that resolution.
There's also a sort of thematic of going home or getting home through the right way. So there's quite a few episodes where they're offered some sort of dark magic or a way of getting home that will be the wrong way of doing it. There's I can't remember exactly the episode. There's an episode where it's not Pandora's box, but it's
it's
like
like Zendora.
Zendora's
Zendora's
box,
box,
yes.
yeah.
And they're do they use Zendora's box or do they not? And for various complicated reasons, they kind of do and they kind of don't.
Yeah.
And then there's a sort of very striking episode towards the end of series 2 called The Dragon's Graveyard.
Yes.
Where they contemplate. They decide that the only way they're ever going to get home is if they kill Venger.
Yeah.
If they finally defeat this evil force who keeps sort of getting in their way for whatever reason. So they decide to sort of ignore everything else, ignore Dungeon Master, and plot to kill Venger. And there's this whole thematic about whether murdering even someone as evil as Venger is justifiable, which is a sort of really interesting, almost sort of Aristotelian meditation on ethics. So it's interesting.
Well, this is and this is why the second series and the third series differ in lots of ways to the first.
The first is almost unwatchable. If you are a 30-something academic with not much time on their hands who needs to watch this thing for a podcast, it's pretty tedious affair. Series 2 things pick up a little.
So,
bit,
but I think the reason it picks up is, and I've been trying to think about this and why, and I think the first series is about their relationship to not each other but to the various monsters.
Yeah.
So a lot of the episodes are about, and you can kind of go through the episodes, and they must do this. So they must destroy something called the Beholder. They must they're captured by a sorcerer called Kellic. They're captured by Warduke. They must defeat a bog beast and visit the river that runs upside down, or the heart of the dragon, or the circle of power.
lots of things of things
on the Garden of Zin. So there's lots of and so actually what the first series is, it's just 13 episodes of them trying to engage with a particular monster, and kind of there's not really much of them learning the rules of the world. They're just in it, and
this is it, isn't it? It's sort of world building, but it's not really, because it doesn't teach you any rules of the world. There aren't really rules in this world, other than basically whatever Dungeon Master says goes, but you won't know what it means until it's happened anyway, so I wouldn't really worry about it too much.
That's the best way to build fictional worlds, and that's retrospectively for the Dungeon Master.
You don't learn much about anything, but I guess if there's not a world building, there's a world filling in or whatever. They're always in a different place, a different region.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting about the first series then is that I would say the first 10, 11 episodes of the first series is that it's about their relationship to the creatures that they're discovering. And there's a kind of I wrote sort of the Ghibli. There's a Studio Ghibli quality to some of the monsters.
Okay.
They're quite I don't know. I don't know what I mean by that, but in the way that they're designed, often they take familiar objects, turtles, I don't know, and I blanked on all animals now, and then make them monstrous. But there's something, I don't know, there's something very Ghibli-esque about some of the monsters, pigs that are grotesque or something like this. And then there's a moment, I think it's the 12th episode of the first series, The Lost Children, where they meet other people. And from then on, the rest of that, so the last 2 episodes of that series, The Lost Children and Presto Spells Disaster, into Series 2 and into Series 3 are much more about their relationships to each other. We learn more about, there are hints about their relationship to Venger. There's one episode, I think, in the second series where Venger lets them off. He lets them off and walks away, and he's like, next time I'll get you. So the first series is about their relationship to the monster of the week, the dragon turtle, the slime beast.
Who is usually working with Venger, or Venger's controlling
or as a disciple,
them secretly.
And then suddenly, at the end of the first series, and then I think it's into the second series, certainly the beginning of the second series, you meet characters that by the end of the episode get turned back into their human form. You meet a queen who is a human. You meet a warrior who is cast to live in a certain way, but then gets transformed back into human, and you get more. I felt like you get more human characters, and suddenly it was about their relationships in a different way. So
I guess the role of the children shifts somewhat. And in the first series, they're the sort of adventurers, aren't they?
Yeah,
they are. You must.
Well, they're playing the game.
We need you to go and get this, do this, kick that, push that, knock that over, kill this thing.
Yeah.
That they're very much the doers. And then in the second, they're much more sort of almost observers of
And
other
helpers.
dynamics that are going on. You're right. Like, there are often allies they meet who have got their own backstories that we learn about, and they are given a certain sort of resolution, and they're the catalysts of change, but they're not necessarily the heroes.
Yeah. Or that. Yeah. I mean, or they help. I don't know. Is it that they have more decisions to make because they are the experienced ones of this world? I've just put series 2. The script is better. I just feel like there's a lot of, or you get a bit more complexity. So the first series, as we said before, the beats are very generic and it is very formulaic. Right at the start of the second series, you get a character in an episode that is called The Girl Who Dreamed Tomorrow, which is about a girl called Terry who is lost within this game, if you like, the Dungeons and Dragons ride, and she can see the future. So suddenly we've got an instance where an episode starts to play, with its narrative. It's not just linear. It jumps forward and you have a fantasy sequence where she dreams about high school and how she might kind of have a relationship with Bobby back at school, and then it jumps back again. So there's suddenly we've got a bit of narrative complexity that is sorely missing or sorely lacking from the first 13 episodes. It's a very linear and very, this happens and then this happens and this happens, Dungeon Master appears, done. Whereas actually right at the start of the second series, we start to introduce there's a bit of play with narrative. What could we do? We could bring it's not the world that's being played with, it's the story within, or the way that the world is being articulated to us as viewers. We get a jump forward and a jump back. And suddenly it gets a little bit more interesting, I thought, anyway.
Yeah, no, I'd probably agree with that. What about the animation, Chris?
So while we were watching it in our respective homes, I remember messaging you with a screenshot from the series where one of the characters' legs is just cut off from the frame.
Post it up on Twitter.
As a little nugget. The animation is, well, okay, it's not great, but also it's not poor. It's not, and we've talked previously about different ways or different forms and styles and aesthetics of animation. We've talked previously about limited animation and a kind of post-war modernist limited style, largely popularized by Studio United Productions of America, UPA, reducing the frame rates. It's not really about realistic imagery. It's about suggestions of imagery or suggestions of place and space, minimal backgrounds. We've also talked previously again about anime and how anime can use limited backgrounds perhaps to connote movement. This is a very rich world. A lot of the characters are very well designed. The kind of thought processes behind a lot of the monsters. There are bits where it's a little bit loose, and there is that sort of kind of compositional looseness to it. But it's not limited in the same way as, I guess, animation scholars would use the term limited to describe a conscious kind of condensation or reduction of style. It's also one of the things that it reminded me of was this process, Syncro-Vox, that was kind of originated in the 50s, which is this method of using static images with superimposing human talking lips onto these cartoon drawings. There are moments where which is a cost-cutting exercise. You can't animate the mouths, which is still one of the most expensive. One, it's one of the most expensive things to do, but also it's one of the things that you judge the most as a spectator, because you're looking at the lips and you're watching people talk or animated characters talking. So that synchrony between between image and speech is really important. So it's not limited in the limited style of animation. It's not limited in the way that Syncro-Vox, this kind of post-war technique, short-lived post-war technique of just superimposing these humans' mouths onto cartoon characters. But I noticed, again, maybe this is just a function of watching it in such a condensed time, but repeated shots, repeated scenes in terms of the way that the animation looks, certain cycles of movement where the background is not really... There's one instance in the first series where I think a building rises or a tower rises from the ground, and they've just moved. I can see they've just moved the film cell up. It's a very strange sort of, I don't know. It's interesting and but it's loose in places. But maybe it's dated rather than a consciously limited style.
Yeah, I sense that there's two ways of addressing that, because I'm glad you're here because basically all I have to say about the animation is I don't think it's very good. But I'm conscious that saying that, one, who cares what I think about the animation, because we're not a review podcast. So that in itself needs a bit of qualifying as to why we don't think it's very good. And I think you've articulated, it isn't an expensive process, is it? It's obviously there's quite a lot of cost cutting going on here. And the other thing is that almost that implies that the animation ever needs to be a certain way for it to be good, which again I sort of would bristle at. So I wonder if we can try and play, and I don't really have an answer to this straight away, so this might be the impossible question of the week, with what the animation therefore does to what we're talking about already, or does it take it off in a new direction? Is the fact that we're telling this sort of high fantasy world that we've already said doesn't really make sense in terms of the typographical or topological sort of relationships. It doesn't make sense in that regard, and the animation doesn't have the sort of lush visual register that others might to visualize this world. A lot of world building theories. I've talked myself into saying something now, so you don't have to answer the question just yet, Chris. A lot of world-building theories in film studies are very interested in the sort of affective potential of mise-en-scène. So they're if from the V.F. Perkins's famous article on Citizen Kane, Where in the World, to Tom Brown's article on Gone with the Wind and historical and the Spectacular Vista, all these sort of theories of world building and spectacle often place a huge amount of emphasis on the power of cinema or visual media to represent a world in a single frame through lush visuals, extreme wide shots, all this kind of stuff. And I wonder if this because the show can't do that for whatever production values or anything like that, or chooses not to do that for whatever creative decisions they've made, what it does instead in terms of its world building.
Well, I think there's a scene. I mean, this is where I'm going to lapse into a bit of Star Wars now. Having seen them, I can now reference them.
Sure.
I think it's the third episode, and I've put this is my first note. Third episode of the first season, where I put limited style, and actually that's the episode where trees are falling, but they just seem to move the cells down. They don't animate the process of falling or movement. They create the illusion of life by moving the material upon which the drawing is made.
Right.
So that was quite interesting.
Sorry, say that again. So what do they move?
So rather than animate frame by frame the image of a tree falling,
yes,
they take the one drawing of the upright tree and just move it down.
I see. Okay,
so they're
fine.
So they're moving the material on which animation is. It'd be like getting a computer and putting up a picture of Buzz Lightyear, but then picking up your laptop and shaking it around.
Okay.
I'm moving Buzz Lightyear's moving, but you're only moving the kind of process upon which you're showing it. So that was my first note. I think watching the series that I thought, so this is a sense of limited style here. But then in that same episode, there is a moment where the characters go to a local bar, and in that bar, come restaurant, brasserie, if you will.
Sure.
It's very much like the moment in Star Wars where they go to the bar and there's all these different monsters. And what I really liked is that in that episode, episode 3, it's really flexing its creativity in the breadth of monsters. Like what excited me about the series was that it builds its world from just different kinds of monsters that are just different, and so you didn't really know what you were gonna get. You're gonna get unicorns and wizards, but you're also gonna get bog beasts, and you were gonna get different kinds of ogres and trolls and frogs with spears in episode 5 of the first series, who capture the dungeon master. Even Venger, he's the devil basically, but rather than 2 horns, just has 1. Just clever. And I think there's a line in one of the episodes. Eric says, so this is the season 2, episode 2. He says, it's okay if you're into spells. And I was like, yep, that's true of the whole series. If you're into spells, this is good. So I really liked that right at the start, 3rd episode of the first series, where they go into this bar and the world is built from the creatures that are within it rather than the geography. So I quite liked the fact that the animation was being flexed.
So
creatively.
So that's those 2 moments you flag up there. One is a moment where detail is sacrificed in terms of scenery.
Yes.
And another where detail is actually given to.
Yeah.
character, monster design, creature design.
Yeah.
Is that true of the whole series then, would you say? I'm trying to think that through myself, but there certainly seems to be a lot of stock flat backgrounds in this.
Yeah, and I think given that a lot of the program is based on it's effectively directional movement, how many episodes begin with them being chased by something or they're already on the move? Even from the first episode. The first episode, as we've said before, there is no establishing of the rules of or the terms of the world. The title sequence explains how the characters are trapped. There's no extraneous plot. And then we're into it, and then we're into that kind of Scooby-Doo territory. Fred, Daphne, Wilma. It's basically the characters. It's basically the unicorn is Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, the unicorn is Scooby-Doo.
Or
Presto
Scrappy-Doo.
is kind of Shaggy.
Yeah. Interesting green. It's a cross between Scooby-Doo and a 90s television program, science fiction television program called Sliders.
Oh, I remember Sliders.
With Sliders, which is about a group of people that are trying to get home, and there are various episodes. I remember this.
We should do Sliders sometime.
John Rhys Davis, Jerry O'Connell.
I love Sliders.
But there's an episode of Sliders I've never forgotten when I used to watch it after school, where they go back to the real world and they're not sure if it's the real world. And Jerry O'Connell's character says, "I'm just going to try the gate because the gate squeaks, and I know that this will be our real world if it squeaks." And he tries the gate and it doesn't squeak, so they jump back in and they go off sliding again. Cuts back to the world that they've just been in, and the mum and a handyman come out, and the handyman goes, "I've oiled that gate for you." And you realise that they were home, but they just didn't know it. So it was
save it for the Sliders episode.
It was a cross between Scooby-Doo and Sliders. That was for where I was going with this. But I think what I liked about the series is that because the series is kind of rooted in directional movement, they're always going from one thing to the Dungeon Master appears and, as you say, says go to the Tower of so and so, the River of something. Go there. It means that the characters you can just animate with walk cycles, and then the backgrounds themselves, like the Scooby-Doo backgrounds, can just be passed along, so you get the same repetitive. You only need to animate or have a background with one door and just repeat it, and it looks like they're running along a corridor.
So is the animation doing what we've said aspects of the fantasy are doing in the it's and if you think about the imaginative act of playing this game that I set up at the beginning, when you play Dungeons and Dragons, and I've only done it the once, but when you play it, the most boring dungeon master is the kind of dungeon master that spends 20 minutes telling you where you are. Right? You can imagine you go around your friend's house on a Friday night to play this game, and your friend goes, "Right, you're in a swamp and it's murky, and there are emerald shards of and it starts to try to write Lord of the Rings, because if anyone's ever read Lord of the Rings, Tolkien likes to describe scenery. Yeah. He's obsessed with it. That is a killer. What you want is you're in a swamp, a goblin jumps out, off we go.
Yep.
What are you going to do? Let's get back to character. Let's get back to playing. Let's get back to being, making choices, taking on roles, doing things.
Well, actually, that's it.
If the fantasy's doing that, the animation's doing that. The animation invests the money, the creativity, the time in the characters, but not in the world.
Yeah. It's very character centric, which is why I think I'm drawn to the element of design and the different ways in which these characters are designed. What I really like is actually, I think it is the first episode where you have the characters, once they're in the world, how do we get out of this world? How are we going to return home? How are we going to journey home? And then you have the figure of Merlin, and then Merlin is revealed to be Venger. And I quite like the way that and I quite like the way that the television program was sort of saying, this is the traditional fantasy, but even Merlin is everything. Yeah, you're right. Everything is character centered. There's a lot of metamorphosis that happens with characters. Characters are, characters can see into the future. Characters transform from one thing into the other. They are a soldier who's been transported to this world and has been magicked in a way that means he has to live his life as a skeleton. This character has been transformed into an ogre. This is all very kind of character centered. Everything kind of comes from the characters. And you're right. It doesn't waste time, whether good or bad, in spectacularizing the world. It spectacularizes the characters within it.
Yeah, and you're right. There are some sort of fun. I liked the Merlin sort of twist.
Yeah.
Spoiler:
Merlin is Venger.
Merlin is Venger. I tell you what, one character I really kind of enjoyed on a design level and I'm trying to bring up the name now. So what you're hearing is the tone that I put on when I look through a Wikipedia article. Oh, the Shadow Demon.
Right. Oh,
who's
the
Venger's
right hand.
Who's Venger's sort of right hand man, and definitely isn't Gollum. But he's not really Gollum, but he has a certain Gollum-esque mannerism. But he's actually a shadow, is what he sounds like, a sort of silhouette. And he's introduced a couple of episodes, I'd say about halfway through season 1, this Shadow Demon. He's he's Venger's right-hand man. And what he does is he lurks around in the world, spying on things and then reporting back to Venger. He's a shadow, so he sort of can disguise himself as other shadows, and then sort of fly back across the world, seemingly at lightning speed. Doesn't really report back to Venger in his castle about what they're all up to, which is quite a useful device because Venger doesn't. He's quite a static character. He sort of He usually appears in the final 3 minutes to zap rays.
Actually, because his ongoing narrative is that he wants the weapons.
Yes,
doesn't he? He wants the weapons from the.
That's right. If he gets the weapons, he can destroy, enslave, take over the world.
Yeah. But he's not in. There are episodes where he isn't in it at all. And
there aren't many, but there are lots. There are lots more episodes where he's barely in it until the last couple of minutes, where suddenly he's revealed to be some sort of puppet master behind.
Or that the goblin was secretly not a goblin but was Venger.
Yes,
or
exactly.
There's one episode where there are
a few of them,
where there are 2 dungeon masters and you don't know which one is which, and it turns out it's a villain who presumably has some connection with Venger.
Yes, it's very much a sort of Spectre-esque retrospecting sort of fitting going on, even though it's part of the original narrative where a villain who you thought was just working independently, suddenly it was all masterminded by Venger at one time.
Venger was the author of all of their pain.
Yeah. Absolutely. If Venger appears in No Time to Die, then I will have questions. I think that might be a new invisible car moment. Anyway,
sure.
So Shadow Demon. So what I quite liked about Shadow Demon is, one, I just thought it was a very well designed character. I thought it was well voiced. I'm looking at the voice artist Bob Holt. I don't know Bob Holt as a voicer, but a reasonably charismatic performance. But also there was this sort of there's this sort of visual tick that keeps going, which is that the Shadow Demon the characters will walk out of frame, and then the Shadow Demon will suddenly pop out from some shadow, some gloomy part of the thing that's always been there, and it sort of allows the scenery to suddenly come to life. But it's always some kind of limited aspect of the scenery. It's not like it's a rock that comes to life or a tree. It's the bit of the frame that sort of is just a shadow or is a bit of dark. Usually it's even just a bit of dark or gloom, like a space between 2 objects or whatever.
There's another episode in the first series, the Tower of the. I think it's when they go to the Tower of the Celestial Knights, where they think that they've arrived at the tower and they're looking at a map and they're like, this is not where the building should be. And then you realise it was an illusion that was created by Venger, and suddenly the space has misled them, or the geography of the world has. So we're back to this issue of world building, and the fictional world that is set up is not set up in detail, but the thing that is set up, I guess one of the most enduring aspects of it is that it has the potential to be unreliable.
Yes, it's an unreliable world in that respect. Not that it. Well, yes, in the sense that there's often illusions and tricks and things like that, but also it's sort of, it never sets itself as being. It's certainly a very inconsistent world, isn't it? It's there are tonally it's very inconsistent. Some episodes will feature sort of madcap characters and gnomes and there's one episode where there's a bunch of basically Care Bears.
So this is I'm looking at this is episode.
You're looking at me like, I'm glad you said that. Alex.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why I'm glad you mentioned that. So that's episode 12. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but episode 12 again, the lost children. So this is where the children encounter a group of lost children that look like children, but they're in fact super old. And there are 3 things that are interesting about this episode. One is that I think it's the first instance of a point of view shot, and you get these a couple of times where and it's often Eric, a point of view shot. But there are two lines of dialogue. One is Eric taking the mickey out of the children's names and saying, what do I call you? Thumper, Bambi, and Dumbo. So obviously this is a fictional world in which Disney cartoons exist, essentially. The second line of dialogue is he looks at them and says, did you guys grow up to be Wookiees?
Yeah, there's a couple of Star Wars references.
Yeah, there is.
Isn't there? Yeah.
So I don't really know, and that's the episode that is the most science fiction-y, because that episode ends where the lost children find their way home via a spaceship. I didn't know that, and there's a
Yeah, so tonally it's all over the place as
but
well.
but those kinds of cultural reference points are not in every episode.
No.
And so when they suddenly mentioned Star Wars and Disney, I was like, right, that's an interesting moment where the humor is not, because it's funny because when you look this up online, it's listed as a comedy, not as a fantasy.
Is it?
It's a comedy.
Oh well, that gets us into a whole.
But then you get this.
Don't get me started on things listed as other things.
It's because people mistake comedy as a genre. It's not, as a mode. Thank you, Jeff King, for that in his 2002 book.
If people
film comedy,
if people call it a comedy and it is a comedy, then it's a comedy.
Sure. But it's not that funny. But Eric is quite a funny character and does get funnier. But it's those sorts of it treats things actually very. Thinking about it, the series treats things very seriously and with kind of consequence. You know that it's going to be resolved, but there is still a sense of jeopardy. I think it's not all the unsteadiness and instability of the world is not something that translates into a kind of an inconsequentiality of narrative.
Yes,
it still means
yes. No, that's true. It's not like nothing means anything.
Yeah.
It's just that you'd be very difficult to go. Okay, so to the west of this land, like Oz, you can vaguely picture. Middle Earth, you can exactly. There are professional cartographers out there drawing Middle Earth. This you could not. I couldn't tell you where anything is in relation to anything else. How much of the world of the sea we've seen. How little of the world we've seen.
No.
How far they journey between each episode. Whether any of the characters have ever met any of the other characters. There's none of that. Which is a pleasure in fantasy, this sort of, pleasure in creating all these rules and structures. But I don't think that's a pleasure that is being offered here. I mean, there aren't other pleasures, but that's not what it's going for. It's not going for revel in the awe of this complex. This isn't what Tolkien would call sub-creation, where you have all these consistent rules that the reader latches onto, or the viewer in this case. This is... Dungeons and Dragons is, I think I've, to repeat myself, is an opportunity to play with a loose, high fantasy sort of iconography to stitch it all together. But ultimately, if there's an episode, if we watch an episode of this by about 4 in, where aliens suddenly arrive, or we arrive in a place inhabited in purely by sort of talking mice, both of those things are fine.
Yes.
I wouldn't be particularly concerned about either of those things happening. It wouldn't ruin the feeling of consistency.
Well, because the characters themselves never know or have a sense of the certainty that surrounds them. So they sort of go quite literally go along for the ride and then discover things as we discover them, and they are as dubious about things as we are, and as skeptical. They also are learning their trade as well. So part of the reason I think Presto is a good character is just simply because he doesn't really know how to do magic. And so they are the fact that they are playing roles is never not lost on us as spectators, because the characters themselves are kind of coming to terms with this world. I mean, I would say that moving into the second series, there's in addition to the narrative play and complexity that I think is at work right from the start. You have the first episode where they find an old calf from their fairground ride as a reminder of but actually it gets a lot more kind of complex. There are moments to tie in with Terry's ability to see the future in the Girl Who Dreamed Tomorrow episode. You do get a bit more of it's visually more interesting. You get a bit more, so her dream sequences, backgrounds are removed. It's a lot more kind of expressionistic and a lot more exploratory in the way that it plays with its visual style. But up to that point, I wouldn't be surprised if it reuses backgrounds, it does reuse shots and things like this. But and then I think the second episode is where Venger lets them go and the characters leave, and we've just got the Dungeon Master left on screen, and he says, he said, I can't remember the dialogue exactly. So this is the second episode of the second series, The Treasure of Tardos, where the Dungeon Master is on screen at the end as the characters are walking away, and he says something that alludes to the fact that it was his fault. Whatever happened.
And then to get Star Warsy again. Spoiler alert. At the end of the Dragon's Graveyard episode, he alludes to the fact that Venger is in fact his son. Yeah. So there's
and this was to be if reading
the Return of the Jedi moment was going to be the final episode, wasn't it?
Yeah. And this was going to be where Dungeon Master was revealed to be the father of Venger.
And Venger was going to somehow be redeemed.
But we'll never know. I do think up until that point, and moving into I think it's the first episode of Series 3, the dungeon at the heart of Dawn. this is a return to, this is not Zendora's box, this is the box of Balefire, which lets loose this kind of ultimate evil. And seriously, it's a lot darker, and that episode in particular is a lot darker. Box of Balefire releases this incarnation of evil. They just call it. It hasn't really got a face. It has it in moments, but it's just this incarnation of evil. It's a very downbeat episode. And suddenly the program shifts a little bit to focus a little bit more on. Obviously, it's done mythology, but kind of the philosophy, religion, all these historical allusions. I'm not going to say it gets deep, but it asks different questions. And this is what I mean. I think the first series is about them coming to terms with the world and confronting their monsters.
And playing Dungeons
and Dragons. It is a fairground ride, and it's just one long fairground ride that has loops and then by the time you get to series 3, they're questioning each other, and you have characters that not fall out, but I think there's an episode. I think it's in maybe it's in season 2 where Hank betrays them. I think that's season 2 maybe.
Yeah, but doesn't. But
they start to get into a little bit of kind of characters with the relationships between each other.
Yeah, they do.
It
becomes a little bit more character based in the second series, doesn't it?
So I think it still maintains the structure, and some of the episode titles fall into that: Citadel of Shadow, Cave of the Fairy Dragons, the Winds. It's very formulaic and very generic, but within that it does evolve and does change over the 27 episodes.
I think we're probably just about out of time. I think maybe as a way of wrapping up, and I haven't asked him in advance to do this, I've just thought of it right now. So this is time for my impossible question.
Oh, good.
As a way of wrapping up, but also sort of to take the discussion a bit more specifically, is there a particular episode that we haven't mentioned that you would say is your favourite, or one that has a particularly interesting thing you'd like to talk about, either just because you liked it, or because of animation, or because of fantasy, or
I do have a favourite episode, and as I just frantically look through my notes, I think my favourite episode is probably either the box. Mm-hmm. So towards the end of the first series, about this box that they can move in various moments and put it in parts of the world, because I think it was the way that it opens out the fictional world, I thought was quite good. I think maybe episode 9 of the first series, Quest of the Skeleton Warrior, or maybe the Dragon's Graveyard from number 2. I enjoyed a lot of the first season episodes more because I remember.
You prefer the first season?
Simply because I was. Each episode deals with like a different monster, and it was kind of all over the place. But I would say. So I would say, either the box. So that's, as I said, episode 11 of the first series, episode 9 of the first series, Quest of the Skeleton Warrior, or episode 20 overall. So episode 7 of the second series, The Dragon's Graveyard. What about you?
I like The Dragon's Graveyard, but we've mentioned that, so I'll pick a few others. They're mainly from season 2, though. I liked. And that's interesting that you preferred season 1, because I thought you were going to hate season 1, because I'm the fantasy guy supposedly, and you don't like quests, you like drawings.
Sure.
That's basically how this works, isn't it? But so I found that sort of perfunctory Monster of the Week stuff a little bit grating, but I have seen.
Because it's very that's why I like Scooby Dooey. That's what I liked.
I have seen a lot of that in my time, and I've seen a lot of very bad high fantasy. And actually, early 1980s is a decade rife with bad high fantasy, because for various industrial reasons, Hollywood and TV broadcasting companies and any kind of multimedia conglomerate are pumping out this kind of stuff for about 5 years till they decide it doesn't really make any money. So this is the era of Conan the Barbarian in cinemas, and Willow, and lots and lots of things that we could bore you about, and probably will in future episodes, so I won't do it.
But it won't be boring when we talk about them.
But perhaps my tolerance of rubbish high fantasy is quite low these days, because I feel like I've wasted far too many days of my life watching that already. So maybe season 2 struck me for those reasons. So I liked the Dragon's Graveyard, but I also liked the episode before it, The Last Illusion.
Okay,
which is this episode where, in fact, there's a recurring thing throughout season 2 where each character at one point gets some sort of either love interest or fraternal interest, or platonic. A new character is introduced that might have a lasting bond.
See, I think
but then
that's
it's
a series
ripped
two.
away.
That's a series 2 thing.
Yes, it is a series 2 thing. And this is Presto's episode.
Yeah.
So what happens here is there is a sort of sorceress character who is introduced called Vala, who's sort of Presto's, who could be a sort of companion for Presto, but it's revealed that she's sort of been cursed by guess who, Venger, to sort of do evil spells for him, and she could get them home, but if she gets them home, she might suffer a terrible consequence and all this kind of stuff. So I quite like that. I thought that was a fun. I thought that was a kind of interestingly tragic character.
Yeah, there are a few that pop up, characters that are cursed. That's the word I've been looking for, that are cursed to live in certain ways. And that's why I think the second series... I think the stories are better, though I enjoyed the first, is that the characters, they are now the old hands, and they can help these characters go back home without having to go back home themselves.
And the final one I liked was Day of the Dungeon Master, where Eric, our faith, becomes Dungeon Master because basically it's Bruce Almighty, but in Dungeons and Dragons. So So Dungeon Master decides inexplicably just to let Eric be Dungeon Master for a bit. It's role-playing. But what's interesting is he can't do it very well, which probably echoes a lot of conversations that we're having in Dungeons and Dragons parties around Europe and the United States at the time, but also the whole thing Dungeons and Dragons stresses to him is this idea of consistency, which is interesting given what we've talked about in terms of the world. So he makes this comment about like, careful now, Eric, you can make a spring appear here and you can drink, but that will create a desert somewhere else. And the sort of balance between all these things, that there are consequences to your actions despite the fact you can do anything, which I think was an interesting sort of slightly meta textual riff on.
Well, as I said, I do think Eric's probably my favourite character because he's the one that makes these references to Star Wars, Wookiees and Bambi and Thumper and Dumber and all that. There are moments where he looks at the camera. He is resistant to a lot of the things that happen in the world. He's often the sarcastic kind of comment. So I think he's an interesting character. We haven't really talked about the discrepancy between the characters, or indeed the racial element. So the kind of racial element.
Oh yes, well the only thing I don't really know if I've got anything to say about that other than this is an early '80s show, and as I say, the African American Diana woman in she's a young girl in it, isn't she? She's about 12, 13, something like that.
Well, she's 14.
Okay, fine. 14,
she's brave and
14,
outspoken,
but she is wearing this sort of extremely problematic. She is cast as I think what she described as in it. I haven't got the Wikipedia page up.
The acrobat.
The acrobat.
Yeah.
But it's basically a sort of Amazonian tribal outfit, which
I
think it's a classic early '80s problem, isn't it? In that on the one hand, good that an African American woman is in this show, because it would have been very easy and very of the time if she weren't. But you take with one hand, you take away with another, and that she's very much coded as that.
I was thinking of
certainly in the visuals.
If we're connecting, if we do our obligatory Bond reference, this is 2 years before Grace Jones in A View to a Kill. In fact, it's around the same time, and so I think you're right that there is a representation, or there's an issue around representation where. I wouldn't say that Diana is necessarily othered, but her costume is very...
others.
He's very...
It's not in the dialogue, but it's in the visuals.
Is very kind of problematic in the way that she said that she's sort of dressed in these animal skins, or there's fur and things like this.
And she's got a lot of flesh on display.
Yeah, she does have a lot of flesh on display, and there are a couple of episodes where the animation is incomplete. And so they haven't completed her, and in fact, hers is the character where her legs are cut off. Interesting enough. So, I think there's
that's worth flagging up,
yeah.
But I'm not sure there's anything particularly nuanced or interesting to say about it other than that. Final note: I don't know if you have information on this, but I have none. So if you don't, fine, we'll skip over it. This is a co-production, from what I can tell, between there's sort of three entities involved here that I don't know anything about.
Yeah.
One of them is Marvel,
yeah.
Which I do obviously know a bit about now, but I don't know a lot about early Marvel. So I do you know anything about early Marvel productions?
No.
Any Marvel experts out there? Give us a shout. We'd love to learn about what Marvel were doing in the early 80s that made them make this. But the other two perhaps we could talk about, the other one we could talk about is this is actually produced by a Japanese animation company, which we should flag up. I'm going to let you take it away from here because this will involve me pronouncing things, and we've learned from the past this always leads badly. So, do you know anything about this company or?
No, I mean I'm having done a little bit of reading about it and how, as you say, it was this kind of co-production between Marvel. And then the Japanese animation company.
They didn't produce it, but they did a lot of the animation. They were sort of outsourced.
Yes. So they did the animation, then it was hosted, as you said, on kind of CBS. And so, I mean, Toei them as a production company, and I'm probably pronouncing this entirely wrong, is a kind of a Japanese company who I think have focused more on television than feature films, though I could be wrong. And it seems like they have a lot of they focus a lot more on kind of fantasy and science fiction. Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert on Japanese, so I'd love to hear people's thoughts on Toei.
I'm looking through their IMDb page. It's quite interesting, actually. It's
Sailor Moon.
But it's also got quite a long history in that. Yes, it's got things like Sailor Moon, Digimon.
Yeah, well, Dragon Ball is one of the, I guess, one of the most famous Japanese anime television
But I'm
series.
also looking. They've also got things like there's a. I'll cut some of this in a second. In their earlier sort of eras, there's something called Gulliver's Travels Beyond the Moon, Jack and the Witch, The World of Hans Christian Andersen. So there's some in this sort of right back to the 60s, 70s. We know nothing about this company. So listeners out there who are more informed, what they call Toei?
Toei, I know.
Is that what we'll go with? Toei. Animation studios. Any experts out there or people who used to work for them or anything like that, get in touch. Maybe we'll do a show on them. And also early Marvel history. And what on earth they're doing, making this slightly odd but kind of fun to watch. Or revisit, in my case, TV show.
I only have one. My final thing, as I mentioned right at the start, was going to be on voices. So Venger is voiced by Peter Cullen, who, as I mentioned, was the voice of Optimus Prime and has done several kind of television programs and voices for Gremlins, My Little Pony, G.I. Joe. So it has a long kind of history, and more recently was in this re-emergence of the Transformers film franchise. He's been kind of brought back to do voices of Optimus Prime, and Nemesis is his other character. And he's also the voice of Eeyore as well in Winnie the Pooh.
Original Winnie the Pooh.
Yep. Two other people I'd like to mention.
And he voices Venger.
He voices Venger. Frank Welker, who's a voice artist who works largely in terms of, I guess, animal animal noises, so not necessarily speech, but he's done.
He's uni in this.
He is uni, and he's also the five-headed Tiamat, the five-headed
we have not got
dragon.
We have not got time to talk about Tiamat, but yes, fine.
So he is also was also the voice of Fred in Scooby-Doo.
Okay,
nice
call back to Scooby-Doo.
And the only other name that I'd like to mention is Russi Taylor. So Russi Taylor isn't listed as one of the main cast, but she is listed under additional voices in a few of the episodes. And died last year, in fact, July 2019, and has voiced a lot of characters in DuckTales, but probably people know her as Martin from The Simpsons. Oh, right. So it's one of those programs that when you're watching and you see the voice cast, you go, oh yeah, I know that, recognise that name. Or so I think it's interesting for lots of reasons, and that is also another reason. We have lots to say about voices and star voices and vocal performances, but it seems like people that were kind of trained voice artists and who have gone on to be known within voice artist circles were part of this program.
Great. Well, I think that does us for another week. We have been Fantasy Animation. You can find more about Fantasy Animation at fantasy-animation.org. You can read our latest articles, our latest reviews from our various contributors from the worlds of industry, academia, creative practitioners all over the world.
You can pitch us ideas for blog posts, please do.
Please do. There's a contact tab on the website. You can follow us on Twitter at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research, as well as on Facebook through the various tabs. We're still not on Instagram, but if I keep saying it, maybe it will come true. And leave us a review, subscribe to us on whatever platform you're on. Tweet about it, tell your friends. It all makes a difference, and our numbers still are going up steadily, and that's nice to see. So we'd like to keep it that way. So that's great. Chris, that's us for another week.
Yeah, so as I said, it was nice to not that I don't love our guests, of course, but nice to be sitting here chatting with you about a program that I had no idea what it was about and begrudgingly admire.
Right. Well.
The program, not you.
We'll end it on begrudgingly admire. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Who was that?
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.